Just two minutes in. Well, unfortunately, I'm not able to hear you, so you'll have to let me know what that brief intro was.
Then I will signal for. Hello, can you hear me now? Hello,
Can.
you can hear me now. Okay, good. So I was introducing you, and I said you are the chair of Africa CSO, the Civil Society Organization Committee of the African EU Partnership Forum, and you're past chair of the African Law Committee of the Section of International Law of the American Bar Association, and served on the boards of the Caribbean Africa Fund. Michael Sudarkasa has vast experience as a commercial attorney and economic development practitioner, specialized in African private sector development, international trade and investment, promotion and facilitation, corporate finance, and private equity investment. And today, what we are interested in is to learn a little more about some of the institutions on the African continent. We're going to do some more about Pedestra. Somebody from Senegal will probably be talking to us about that. But we're also interested in the free trade. We've learned that there are 42 currencies on the African continent, and this makes trading, intra-African trading, very difficult. So we just want you to give us an idea of the African continent when it comes to trade and the structures that we have on ground. Can you hear that?
Sure, I did hear that.
Thank you very
And
much.
and no, you're welcome. And colleagues, I'm going to give you, and it's a website that we produced during COVID for the African Union. Unfortunately, they have not updated it, but it's useful. It's www.auti.africa. I may even try and just share my screen. If I have share screen permissions. Do I have share screen permissions?
We do. I think the co-host.
Okay. While that is coming up, I will, and then I'll share screen. I'll just talk to you. So you have, um, oh, it is here. Let me do this quickly. 'Cause. 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 So can you see my screen?
I'm going to, yes, I'm just going to check it. Yes, we can see it. We can see it.
Right. So I've given you that resource, and I'm asking that colleagues look at it. What you'll find is that the content, much of it is around circa 2021, 22. But it was a project for the AU, and it's very helpful in providing more information than I'll be able to provide this afternoon in terms of the queries that you had. But I will spend my time just sharing that the African Union is really the preeminent policymaking body on the continent, which began under the name of the Organization of African Unity, um, really in the early 60s, I should say. Ghana was the first of the African countries to become independent in the late 1950s. Um, as African countries became independent in the 60s, some in the early 70s, the idea was to create an organ that would allow for the regional integration of the continent. The basis and the hubs around which this was to be developed were the regional economic communities. And so in West Africa, you have ECOWAS as the leading REC, or Regional Economic Community. Southern Africa, you have SADC, the Southern Africa Development Community. In East Africa, you have the East African Community, and you had the Maghreb regions in the north, and ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. And later you had COMESA, the Common Market of Eastern and Southern African States. We now have those as kind of the basis or the platform through which the aim was to have the 54 countries of the continent to be one, very similar to what you have in Europe with the European Union. When you talk about trade on the continent, the challenges that currently, you mentioned the many currencies, the many African currencies that we have, is very difficult to change, let's say, Naira into Rand or Kula or Kwacha. These are just some CDs of the currencies. And so the US dollar is actually the predominant currency of trade today as we speak. The African Exim Bank, which you didn't mention, but is a very critical institution when you talk about facilitating the trade. So in the U.S., we have the U.S. Export-Import Bank. An Export-Import Bank typically loans money to buyers internationally who want to buy product from the country where the bank sits. So the Afri-Exim Bank is based in Cairo, Egypt, and basically helps facilitate transactions of those who want to buy made in Africa products. It's also the leading institution from a financial standpoint behind the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also something called the Intra-African Trade Fair that they created now, and it's about 7 years ago. There's been one that's been held in Egypt. It's been held in Egypt twice, including last year. It's been held in South Africa, but it's meant to be a major meeting of producers on the continent, buyers on the continent, and also international buyers. So the premise of AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is now going to its third year, is to have Africa unlock potential by trading with itself, economic potential and development. Roughly, Africa imports in just food alone $50 billion worth of food from outside of the continent. And the idea is that if that 50 billion was spent internally, this is just on food, but there are other products that are made, the continent would accelerate its development. Key products from the continent, obviously, are mineral assets, again, most of the time that are sold without being processed. The aim of AFTA is to encourage processing on the continent before reselling off the continent and utilization on the continent. When you think about the African Union, and I mention it as a policy-making organ, if you think of it in the context of the U.S., it's like Congress. And if you think of the African heads of state who are the members of AUC, they're like senators representing their countries. The aim of the African Union Development Agency, which again was initially called the NEPAD Agency, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, is to actually have an organization funded by Africans delivering for Africans. The state of affairs to date, though, is that you still have significant development partner contributions from the European Union, from the U.S. through the U.S. Agency for International Development, from China, Turkey. And again, I'll take you back to the AUTI.Africa because I talk about in that portal the different partnerships that exist, and as well the different institutions that you have within the AUC. AFTA was just getting started at that point, but it is emerging. In fact, the head of AFTA, who's from South Africa, based in Ghana, was recently in the U.S. about a week or two ago. If you want to talk, and I think this is also important about trade on the continent, of those 54 countries, and I want to give you another resource, tralac.org, TRALAC.org. It's the Trade Law Center of Stellenbosch University, and it regularly produces updates on AFTA and also on regional integration on the continent. And so one of the things, if one wanted to track the development of AFTA, would be to subscribe to the free newsletter of TRALAC. So you can make sure you're getting information. Say that again?
TRALAC, can you spell the link?
Sure. TRALAC. And I'm putting it in my chat as well. .org. Yeah, that's it. So again, when you think of the 5 regions of the continent, and I should say for the colleagues in the US, the African Union is being encouraged to think of the 6th region as diasporans who are outside of the continent, of which the Caribbean and South Americans, where you have African-headed countries, but also you have a large community in the United States and a smaller community, but significant in Europe. They're considered the 6th region of these 5 regions that really comprise the whole of the African Union. In West Africa, again, you have country, if you talk about institutions, certain countries that are anchor countries for that region. Nigeria would be one of the first and foremost for West Africa, but also the continent, as the population of Nigeria is roughly 200 million on a continent of 1 billion. So roughly 1 in 5 Africans are Nigerian. But you also have Cote d'Ivoire, which is an anchor country for the French-speaking countries in West Africa, who actually are the dominant number if you were to divide the French-speaking countries and the English-speaking countries. Ghana is also a very important country in West Africa, particularly for diasporans. There's a very large African-American community, but also Caribbean community in Ghana. And Ghana initiated about 3 or 4 years ago a major right to return initiative. And so you have many diasporans coming and buying property every year in the December holidays, year-end holidays. There are major festivals that are meant to attract people from the diaspora to move to Ghana. Senegal is also an important country in West Africa, equally so because of its own links to the diaspora, huge Senegalese community in the eastern seaboard, but particularly New York. Senegal has made, I'll say, positive waves and news in the last month by electing a 40-plus-year-old president, one of the youngest presidents on the continent, and having a peaceful transition after some thought that there might be more conflict there. Other countries of note in West Africa would be Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. Those 3 countries have recently seceded from ECOWAS temporarily. It takes about a year for that process to conclude. And I won't say too much on this, but one can do some back channel reading. Their lament as countries was that the French government had too strong of an influence yet today, many years after supposed independence. And so they asked them to leave, and the leaders who were quote unquote elected were overthrown in bloodless coups. And so now there's a cartoon that is Echo was, and there's Echo is, and Echo is minus the 3 countries that have formed this alliance. In North Africa, which has, because of its proximity to Europe and also proximity to the Middle East, developed more so than sub-Saharan Africa in terms of infrastructure. Egypt is a leading country in that part of Africa. Morocco and Algeria are also leading countries there. Tunisia is well developed, but behind those 3. At a point before the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya also was a major country in that region. In East Africa, Ethiopia is the 2nd largest country on the continent, 100 million people, and the home of the African Union. So many say that Addis Ababa is the capital of Africa. I'll say, crowned king in terms of being the host of all of the representatives of the continent have embassies in Addis. And twice a year, the AU meets once in Addis in January, February, late January, February, and then once mid-year in one of the other countries. Those are the AU's 2 annual meetings. And around them, there are private sector meetings, there are civil society meetings. There is a U.S. ambassador to the African Union and other ambassadors all in Addis. Interestingly, the edifice for the AU was donated by China. So if you ever travel to Addis, one of the funny things that you'll find when you're in the African Union in the elevators is that they will speak to you in Chinese. I think they may have worked on that to change it, but it was an interesting fact. Um, Outside of Ethiopia in East Africa, Kenya is arguably the center of the region. The um, headquarters of the East African community is in Arusha in Tanzania, but the commercial center is Nairobi. And the critical port, there's two actually in that region, are Mombasa and also Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Tanzania is a fast growing country, um, and their I'll say female headed country because they after President Magufuli passed, his successor is now I think the only woman president on the continent. But they're making great strides as they have gas, they have strong agriculture, and they have strong mining in Tanzania. Kenya is a de facto headquarters of many of the regional institutions operating in East Africa, and some that operate across the continent outside of South Africa. You have the World Bank's International Finance Corporation has its headquarters there, and a number of others. The UN complex is seated in Nairobi as well. The World Food Program, UNDP, IFAD, etc. They're all there. And over the years, Kenya has been the country from which humanitarian aid for challenged countries in the region, and challenged countries could include South Sudan, could include Sudan, could include Somalia, where you've had conflict, where you've had drought. Kenya has been the base for where refugees have come and where aid has left to go. Other important country in the region is Uganda. So again, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania in East Africa. In Central Africa, and it's a country that is part of both the East African community and the Southern African Development Community, and it's at the heart of the whole continent, is the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. When you talk about mineral resources of Africa, DRC arguably is one of the most blessed countries on the continent. But it is also a country that has had the least development from its resources. So when you talk about infrastructure or the absence thereof, DRC has Kinshasa as its capital in the west, and in the east, Goma in that area and down. Lubumbashi is a manufacturing hub and mining, significant natural resources. People talk about critical minerals today, and these are the minerals that power your cell phone, your computer, your tablet. Arguably, DRC has the greatest concentration on the continent, one of them. And so there's a lot of mining in DRC, but there's also a history of conflict in that region in the east as well. Other countries of note that are smaller, that straddle Central and East Africa, are Burundi and Rwanda. Rwanda is becoming a major conferencing and meeting facility for the whole continent because it's kind of centrally based on the continent. Tech-focused, strong agrarian economy and a touristic economy. Outside of DRC, Cameroon and Gabon are two of the more dynamic economies in that region. In Southern Africa, South Africa by far is the largest economy. Overall, Nigeria and South Africa have gone back and forth over the last decade as to who was first or second. Egypt is sometimes in the mix at third or second. But those are the big three: Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa. And South Africa currently is the largest economy on the continent. When you talk about currencies, South Africa is one of the few currencies where the local currency dominates, which is the rand, the South Africa rand. And it's a country that has exchange controls. If you want to take your rand and turn it into dollars and export it out of the country, you have to petition the central bank for that. This policy was put in place in 94, 95 after democratic elections in the country occurred, and there was a fear of flight of capital owned by white South Africans as the political reins moved from white South Africans to Black South Africans. And it remains in place today, which means that in South Africa, trade is done within the region, Eswatini, Lesotho, even Namibia and Botswana in a rand denomination. In West Africa, I should mention the French-speaking countries, except the three that have succeeded. Well, right now, I still think you can use the CFA in those regions, but that was one of the benefits that the French said they bestowed on French-speaking West Africa, was that the CFA is pegged 2-to-1 to the euro. So if you have €1, that equals 2 CFA, 2 CFA equals €1. And so amongst the countries that were French-speaking, and there's a Central African CFA and a West African CFA, you can trade that currency. Now, the challenge is Nigeria is the biggest economy in the West African region, and you cannot trade easily the CFA with the Naira, which is, so in effect, as I mentioned, the dollar is the currency of trade in many states in West Africa. Outside of South Africa, notable economies in Southern Africa include Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique. Mauritius has emerged. You mentioned that in my career, I've worked in private equity. Mauritius is one of the hubs for private equity on the continent. If you look at doing business indices in terms of ease of doing business, security of capital, Mauritius is always in the top 1 or 2 countries on the continent. And so there's quite a bit of investment capital that sits in Mauritius that is deployed in different countries on the continent. Zambia is also another important country because it's land linked. I think there's about 8 or 9 countries that touch Zambia. It has large commercial farms, and it's one of the breadbasket countries of the continent. I'm going to say a few more things that are really just about the trajectory of the continent, in that in the next 3 decades, so the next 30 years, which is in the lifetimes, hopefully, of your students, every decade there will be close to 330 million more Africans as the continent is on its way to doubling in population by 2050. So that's basically the size of the United States every 10 years. What that's doing is creating tremendous market growth on the continent, in real estate, in agriculture, in infrastructure, and in trade. So before, African producers sought almost exclusively to sell their products off the continent, whereas now with a growing market on the continent, the thought is that there's markets near to home. You also have the fastest growing labor force in the world in Africa. And so just as in the 70s, 80s, 90s, China was the world's manufacturing base, there are many trying to see how Africa can become that with a very young labor force. And the age is now, I think the average age on the continent is 15. So it's a very young continent. I'm keen to stop there and ask if there are other specific questions, but I wanted to kind of give you a bigger picture sense of how one can look at the continent, and again, the AU being the policymaker, the key two other, I mentioned the Afri-Exim Bank, but I would be remiss if I did not mention the African Development Bank, which is headquartered in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, with now regional offices in Tunisia, in Kenya, in South Africa, and country offices in a number of other states. That is the bank's or the continent's development bank. And it provides both, I'll say, preferential loans to countries and also commercial loans to countries. And it raises capital on global capital markets. It has AAA credit rating, principally investing in infrastructure, but also the social capital development and agribusiness and agriculture is a particular interest of the current president, Adesina, who was the Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria before he became the president of the African Development Bank.
Well, this is a very good panoramic view of the African continent. Does anybody have any question before I ask mine? Okay. The only question I would want you to address, and it's looking into your crystal ball. How do you see the African continent in terms of trade in the next 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years? We have looked at, or we listened to Okonjo-Iweala, who is the Director General of the World Trade Organization, talking about Africa rising, and from Africa as a basket case, to Africa rising. And in 1996, it was said that nearly half of the conflict zones in the world were in Africa. Now, this is 2024. What do you project will be the trade dynamics within the African continent? How do you see Africa in the future? And what will be the basis of your submission?
No, thank you. And I would say in the discussion, like the one that you framed, you have Afro-pessimists and you have Afro-optimists. And I fall into the category of the Afro-optimists. I see the framework, and we're just at the beginning of that is being laid by AFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, as a tremendous catalyst for not only trade, but industrialization and a focus on value addition on the continent. Because it's creating, and what it's meant to do, if you haven't talked about that in the course, is basically, if you consider a harder border around the edges of the continent and a more porous border within the continent with incentives for countries to trade or to have, if you're trying to sell into this market of, in 2050, 2 billion people, you'll have preferential opportunities to do so if you have a presence within the continent. So again, that is what the European Union has done and did when it became the European Union versus the European Community, when each state was its own state, but they said, no, let's have and devolve some of our power to Brussels so that we can trade with each other more cost effectively and to our own benefit more than those outside. So that is what AFTA is one of the catalysts of. Now, the things that are happening that lead me to think that Africa is moving towards a period of greater trade. One is greater integration by infrastructure. So there are a series of highways being built around the continent. There's investment. And again, not enough investment, but investment going into the the rail system, the port system. You're having far more airlines being founded and then flying from outside into the continent. Africans are engaging in intra-African tourism in much higher numbers than they did before. You also have, as a catalyst for trade on the continent, a growing diaspora that itself has its own wealth. There are lots of research done by publications like Black Enterprise about the consumer spend of African Americans and Africans in America to date, which was some years ago like $8 billion. I mean, it's a lot. It might probably be more than that. It's probably double digit. There's an interest in on the continent because there are many more African immigrants living in the U.S. who are looking back to the continent. There's a company that produces product called Shea Moisture that again was produced in West Africa from shea butter, sent to the U.S., turned into cosmetic products. The story of the family that did that is a significant one because the basis of it was trade and of an African agricultural product that they used in the consumer products, and they were able to sell their company to Unilever a few years ago for close to $1 billion. And with those funds, bought Essence Magazine, among other things, created funds to support. So now you have diasporans who are also looking at the continent as an investment destination. And that's driving and looking at countries like the United States as the market of target. That's driving trade. You have increased trade also because South Africa, after apartheid, South African corporations began to explore how they could do business in other parts of Africa because for so many years, they were embargoed from doing so. So you have companies like MTN, which is a telecommunications company, mobile telephony. Their biggest market is Nigeria. You have companies like ShopRite, which is a food company that has expanded around the continent. That trend continues. And as you have transboundary supply chains and value chains, that's also pulling trade around the continent. You have greater, again, trade even in media products, social media. You have streaming service companies providing, again, a view of Africa that Africans didn't have before. So that now if I'm in Lagos, I get to see what it's like in Johannesburg or what it's like in Abidjan or what it's like in Nairobi. And so you have young Africans also studying. There's a whole association of African research institutions that, again, allows a person to get their undergrad degree one place, get their MBA another place. And so as people travel, the MICE industry, meetings, incentives, conferences, exhibitions, is growing on the continent. So you have major conferences like the Mining Indaba in Cape Town that brings people from all over the world. And so as people realize that the person that could be my counterparty is somewhere else on the continent, I'm trading with them. As the resources of the continent become more attractive, and I don't say they ever became less attractive, but they're heightened attractiveness as we move into the world of AI and tech. Africa is one of the few places where you can get a number of the resources needed for these devices. So there's a new scramble for Africa to get those products out. Trade is involved. As you have institutions like the African Development Bank, Afri-Exim Bank, and the AU trying to help African countries basically enter into better deals than they did in the 70s. You now also have more of that wealth staying on the continent. There's a whole other conversation we can have about how the public sector sometimes misuses that wealth, and there's graft, et cetera, but you have that everywhere. So I'm basically one who thinks that after the rise and strengthening of, I'll say particularly the private sector on the continent. It's always been SMEs. It's still predominantly SMEs, but you're having a growing group of multi-million-dollar companies on the continent in technology. You have billionaires like Dangote who didn't exist, or Patrice Motsepe here in South Africa, who are showing that wealth can be created on the continent, and they're a magnet for other investment. Headwinds, climate change is a major issue that the continent is grappling with. An aging population of leaders who are clinging to power in many instances. That's a challenge that this young, youthful continent may not tolerate. So, those who are Afro-pessimists say, well, just as much as they could build the continent, they could tear it down, who are young people. Other headwinds are conflicts outside of the continent that can influence the continent but have nothing to do with the continent. So the crisis in Ukraine, last year, it's ongoing, made the price of fertilizer rise to $1,000 a metric ton from $300 a metric ton, which meant that Africa's predominantly smallholder farmers could not buy fertilizer. And you need fertilizer to get the yields in many instances, these are food subsistence farmers. So they do sell, but basically they're growing for themselves. So if they have a bad crop, you enter in a situation where you can have food insecurity. So those are some of the challenges. The conflict in the Middle East definitely threatens to divide the continent between who basically, are you on the West side or are you on the Middle Eastern side? There's a growing strength in an organization called BRICS. I don't know whether you've studied BRICS, but it's basically, you would think of it as, it's Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa. Those are the acronyms, but now Egypt has joined BRICS. I think Ethiopia has joined BRICS. I mean, so there's a number of larger, Iran, I believe, has joined BRICS as well in the last year or two. And so you typically had the OECD countries, and then you had a much smaller group of Southern Hemisphere countries. And now BRICS is emerging, and they're trying to do things like create a BRICS currency. So it'll be interesting to see in the next few years, but at the center of the world, Africa is attractive because there's a quarter of the arable land in the world that remains on the continent. The continent also, I talked about climate change. It's an environment which has low carbon production for the most part. South Africa is one of the exceptions. But if you're trying to have carbon offsets through the growth of trees, it has vast areas where you can continue to grow trees, and so that makes it attractive. So I think increasingly the continent will be attractive. In that attractiveness, that will stimulate trade, it will stimulate investment, youthful population where you can manufacture more cost effectively than in China and in most other places. And existing in that portal, auti.africa, that I shared with you, I talk about all of the other parts of the world, Africa partnership. So you have Turkey, Africa, you have Japan, Africa, and TCAD, you have China, Africa, you have US, Africa, you have South Korea, Africa. And so all of those relationships, unfortunately, what I say as well is that the world has a strategy for Africa, and Africa yet doesn't seem to have a uniform strategy for all of these different parts of the world. And that's something to be developed. I'll stop there. But in general, I am an optimist, and that's why after 25 years of moving from Washington, D.C. here, I'm still as excited about the continent as when I first came.
Well, I hope your excitement about the African continent will rub off on the 5 students that are here. moving away from that view of National Geographic of Africa as a place of just animals and forests and savanna to a place in which Time actually, I think Time on Newsweek actually did say Africa Rising. And the whole idea of the investment opportunities that Africa is attractive, is a place to be. We've gone through quite some of this, and we're just rounding up now to take a look at some of these things. One of the major things that I haven't said in that way, that you have also said, is the question of the soft power. The entertainment industry on the African continent is really reaching out to the rest of the world. And hopefully, these are the new things that will shape the perception of non-Africans about Africans. Well, I can thank you enough on behalf of the students. Thank you very much. Just in case we have any other question, I would contact you by email. We just have 2 classes more to go, and it will be a wrap for the semester. Thank you very much for this enlightening perspective and the view around Africa. I'm just going to close the session, and I will let you go. I know it is almost.
It's about 8:30, 6:30 my time. I had 2 more comments that I wanted to say to you. For those who may be interested and may not know, there's an organization called Select Africa. It used to be called, excuse me. I was going to say Select Africa. I should say Select Florida. It used to be called Enterprise Florida. And Select Florida actually has an office in Durban in South Africa. I think they have another in Kenya. But their role, because we're talking about institutions, is actually to facilitate exports from the state of Florida to Africa. The second thing I was just going to say was that I know you all, I think, are in Gainesville.
Yes.
My family is from 3 hours south of you, Fort Lauderdale. And so when I take a break in the summers, my summer is your winter. So that's December, January. Lauderhill, Florida is where I go. So when I saw that you were from Florida, I was particularly interested in reaching out to you. But anyway, thank you for this opportunity to share. I hope some of the students will think about Googling and looking at some of these websites that I've mentioned.
Yes.
And I would just say also consider taking a trip. There are direct flights from Atlanta, direct flights from Washington, D.C., direct flights from New York, JFK. Some years ago, South Africa Airways was working on one from Miami, but I don't think that materialized. You can go to Morocco from Miami, because I know Air Morocco flies, but it's a potentially life-altering thing to be able to visit contemporary Africa. And again, I appreciate the role that streaming media is playing. So if you look at Netflix today, there are many contemporary films and shows that give you a contemporary view of Africa that years ago you couldn't get. So it shouldn't be on a bucket list. This is really an opportunity continent for all of you.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Take care. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay. Well, let me just pull up a few of the websites he talked about. This is the Tralac that you can use in case towards the end of the semester, the final project you'll be doing. All of these things he talked about after, that is a free zone. And then these are the sub-regional organizations, and they're all for business. All of these, you begin to see that the view of the African continent should not just be people dying of wars. We give away. If this class was in 1996, we'll be talking about conflict zones. We'll be talking about people killing themselves. They're still there. They're still there. You still have it in Nigeria. You still have it in South Africa, but it's not the main thing that the world is talking about now. Nobody is talking about Africa as a basket case, as a hopeless place, but there are opportunities. And just like he rightly said to us, even in Florida, there is there is Select Florida and connecting companies in Florida and Africa. So these are things that, in case you're interested in internship or you want to use some of the knowledge you have, but definitely if you go for an interview, you want to know your knowledge of the African continent. And these are some of the things that you could probably share with them that will surprise them that you know about. All right, I have with me, I have slides of some of the places he mentioned that I would like to point your attention to. So let me just pull up. And then we'll just go through some of the slides just to reinforce the things he said, because it was just looking through, giving a panoramic view of the continent. Okay, so before let's see, save chart. Okay, cool, show folder. Wow. Okay, so I'm going to end this one.